This podcast is going to be on the government system of absolutism. Absolutism is a political system in which autocratic rulers have complete authority over the government and the lives of the people in their nations. Autocracy is a form of government in which the political power is held by a single individual. Therefore, it is a centralized portion of power where one person is in complete control of everything. It's supported by the theory of divine right, which says God created the monarchy and the monarch acted as God's representative on earth. So basically, the individual has a connection to God that makes them a better ruler than anyone else can be. And this kind of connection gives them the power to do what they want to do on earth. It was often said that the state of the king is the supremest thing upon earth, for kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. That is to receive what God may do is blasphemy. I will not content that my power be speeded upon. Okay? That represents a quote that shows us by Louis XIV the idea that the king had this connection to God that nobody else could touch, and he justifiably was the supremest thing on earth. Why did this happen in the first place? The first idea is a centralized government. Under Louis XIV and rulers like him, government became smaller in the sense that fewer people had any say in the day-to-day operations of the government. Most were held by the king who is in charge. The second is the growth of the middle class and the commercial revolution. With the commercial revolution that takes place during the end of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, we start to see towns and cities grow. When towns and cities grow, these large towns and cities come under the control of very powerful people, and such will eventually flow into the fact that they're king. The Protestant Reformation was important because it took power away from the Catholic Church, and it was one less area that a king had to contend with for his power. Also, the age of exploration, as nations became richer, and they had more money, and their territories became bigger, and their kingdoms became bigger, these kings became more powerful. Why was nationalism? People were looking for a sense of basically what this individual could do and represent. They were a figurehead for society. They were a sign of pride within these nations. The sixth was dynastic rule, and that was the basic idea that rulership stayed within a family. So obviously they became more powerful as time went on. And seven was divine right, or the idea that individuals would have the opportunity to have this connection to God that we talked about earlier, and that this was going to propel them to even greater heights of power. The strengths of the system. It was a strong central government that was unified, and you could go through this massive territorial expansion, and change occurred quickly. It got things done. You had strong military. You had a clear line of succession. So all these things were good when it came to a system that was set up basically as a form of absolutism. However, the weaknesses were there, and the glaring weakness is going to be you depend on the ability of one person or one man or woman to rule over an entire country, and that's impossible when they don't have the expertise in certain areas. Other things that come into play here are sacrifice national interest for personal wish. What if the individual is not out for the good of the country and are only out for the good of themselves? That becomes a large factor in this as well. No freedom of speech. How are you going to, or worship? You have to rule, you have to worship whatever the king or queen themselves worships in terms of religion. You can't speak out against the king or the queen. That idea of it's my way or the highway. And also, you disregard the needs of the people, especially minorities. The military used for personal vendettas, so if you have something against someone else from another country and you want to attack, it might not be within the nation's best interest. But the strengths of the system are power centralized, so things can be done very quickly, and things can be done very effectively. But the weakness is you're really dedicating yourself to one person being able to do all of that. Okay, the first area we're going to look at is Spain. Spain came up with the basic idea under Philip II that they were going to have this absolute government that ruled supreme. It's a great example for the regions. He comes from the Habsburg family, the most powerful ruling family in Europe. He's an Austrian, and the most powerful monarch in Spanish history. What makes him so powerful is going to be the fact that he's a Catholic. He tried to end Protestantism within his nation. All right, and this is what we talked about when we talked about one of the weaknesses of having an absolute government is you're going to have to participate in the religion of the ruling individual. It increased Spain. It involved Spain in many wars to increase their power, including the Spanish Armada, which was a huge failure. And he supported the Spanish Inquisition. He wanted people tortured and turned away from Protestantism and back to Catholicism in such a way that was harmful to the Spanish population as a whole. And that's why Protestantism never took hold in Spain, even today. He built an enormous palace like all these absolute rulers that ruled over their territory, including the Escorial, which was a beautiful palace built by Philip II. And it symbolized the strength and power of the monarchy in Spain and under his control. He sailed for England in an armada in 1588. He was looking to take control over Queen Elizabeth's England. He fails miserably. He thought God would guide him because, again, this idea of divine right or divine rule, and declares that he can't lose. And the English Navy actually cuts off food and supplies, and Spain is forced to retreat, and they're never the same power after this point in history. In Europe, in the Americas, they continue to have success with their colonies, but in Europe, they just simply do not. And the beginnings of Spain's decline as a European power happen, and the rise of England as a colonial power happens as well. Louis XIV in France is going to be another great example of a monarch that ruled with basically unmatched power during the course of his rule. He became king at age 5, but after age 23, it was all up to Louis as to what happened. He was known as the Sun King, and you know what I say in class, the sun never sets on a badass. And that was basically Louis. He had all the time the light was shined on him. He was the man, the myth, the legend, as we often say in class too. Unmatched power for his time, and probably unmatched power ever in history. He was as important as the sun. Everything revolved around him. He had elaborate court ceremonies. Now, we talked in class about how these court ceremonies were meant to have the nobles fighting and disputing with each other, so that they weren't worried about ruling over Louis. They weren't worried about Louis's rule over them at all. And he really strengthened the monarchy during the course of his rule. The Palace of Versailles came to be one of the largest things ever put together. All of its lands and all of its hunting grounds and everything, it is the size of Manhattan as an island. It was commissioned by Louis XIV. An absolutely huge, humongous demonstration to his wealth and power. 10,000 people resided there. That was the idea, to keep your friends close but your enemies closer. So you had all the people living with him at Versailles so you could keep an eye on them. You had hundreds of nobles and servants waited on Louis XIV. And he resides at Versailles. Those at Versailles were exempt from taxes. So his nobles never paid anything. And this is one of the ways that the system broke down during the French Revolution. But under Louis XIV, it doesn't take hold. Here we can see the wonderful Hall of Mirrors. You see the frescoes on the ceiling here. It truly was a work of art, and that's why it's a museum today. Another look at the Hall of Mirrors here, folks, and the outside grounds. These aren't even the fountain grounds that are there. Louis would walk through the Hall of Mirrors each morning. He would have crowds looking at him as he went through, and the sun was supposed to shine through and radiate off him to make him look like a god. One of the basic premises of it. His legacy. He's famously said, "I am the state." The idea that he is power without limits, no boundaries, no checks and balances. He was a devout Catholic. He, like Philip II, is going to rid his country of anybody who is Protestant. This becomes a huge problem. He kicked out hundreds of thousands of Huguenots. But the problem with them was the fact that they were the basic stronghold of the economy. They're the ones who paid the taxes. They were the middle class, these French working class Protestant individuals who were going to emigrate or leave the country. One of the things that leads to the French Revolution. But Louis was a huge supporter of the arts, music, and drama. He spent so much money on the Palace of Versailles, but in the end, he brought power to new levels, okay? To unbelievably new levels, but he does plant the seeds of the French Revolution with his idea that no nobles were going to pay taxes, that he was going to over-abuse the middle class, that he was going to never call the Estates General into power. These are all factors that we need to keep. The Russian absolute monarchs that follow. They're part of the Romanov dynasty, and we're going to keep it really simple. Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, they really tried to westernize and modernize their nation. had things like the beer tax, and they wanted to make Russia a world power. Peter actually expands the borders and attempts to find the warm water port. He's really unsuccessful with that during the course of his rule, but he does build St. Petersburg, known as the window to the west, which was going to allow for trade with the West, and was going to basically be a way for Russia to compete with these other westernized societies of the time. It's particularly important considering the fact that Russia is going to be fairly behind the times for a large portion of its history. This is the push forward that it needed. You can see the expansion under Peter the Great. He still doesn't have a warm water port that he's looking for. So his legacy is something that we should consider. Like under Louis XIV, nobles did not pay taxes. Nobles still owned serfs. The tax burden was still on the lowest of the population. There was no government incentive to increase agricultural. There were government incentives to increase agricultural production, and it did strengthen Russia's role in foreign affairs, but not completely. They're never on the same page as many of the great European monarchs of other countries. Catherine the Great, she adopted Russian ways and respect for people. She believed all people equal. That's pretty important to her rule overall. But again, she's a westernizer and a modernizer. And we talk about her, we talk about the Shah of Iran, we talk about Kemal Ataturk being these great westernizers. And she, over the course of her rule, there were some problems that she had with peasants, more than before. But she did something that was so great. She found the warm water port and was able to acquire territory from Poland, which greatly helped in the expansion of making Russia a 12-month economy. And this is the end of podcast number 1 on absolutism.